Freedom House. It is so good to see everybody. We're glad you're here with us today. Man, there's some great things happening in the lives of people, man. Their needs are getting met. People are getting healed. People are having student loans paid off. Amen. I need that lady to come pray over me and my wife so our student loan will go away. But just a lot of great needs getting met. And the one thing I love is that this past week, we as a church decided to do this thing called Serve Charlotte. And we spent a week, many different ways, opportunities to serve the people right here in Charlotte and to help meet their needs. And I want to tell you what you did. There were about 300 of y'all that went out and served people. So give yourselves a hand for making a difference. So it's always good to get active and be involved and to see what you can actually do. There's nothing better and nothing greater to take your mind off of your situation and your circumstance if it's bad when you begin to do something for someone else. So thank y'all for just being powerhouses for God and loving God enough to serve other people. All right, so let's jump in to this message today. We got a lot of good stuff we're going to talk about. We're in this series. This has been our series for the summer. It's called the Red Letter Edition. The reason why we named that the Red Letter Edition is because in some translations of the Bible, the words that Jesus spoke are written in red letters. So we thought we would name it the Red Letters with the purpose and intent of looking at some of these things that Jesus himself said and beginning to dissect it and figure out what can I learn from what came out of the mouth of Jesus himself. Now today what we're going to talk about and where we're going to find Jesus talking is not in a typical place where you would think to look when someone asks, hey, tell me something Jesus said. Typically, if someone asked me that, I would look in one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. The reason why is because they talk about when Jesus was actually alive. So he was probably talking at that point. However, today, we're going to look in the last book of the Bible. We're actually going to look at Revelation and see what Jesus had to say. So if you never knew it, Jesus does speak post his death and resurrection in Revelation. Now, the guy who wrote Revelation is an apostle and a disciple. His name is John, so he knew Jesus firsthand. Now, I love where John is whenever he gets the words to say and the things to write in this book of Revelation, because he's not at the comfort of his home. He's not somewhere where he's used to. It's actually more like one of these survival shows. Anybody here, by the show of hands, like shows where people are having to fend for themselves and survive and do that? Yeah, I love that. I'm an outdoors guy. So one of my favorite shows I saw about a year ago on Netflix was called Out of the Wild. And this particular one was called The Australian Experience. I'm sorry, not the Australian. What's it? No, the Alaska. My wife should have remembered. The Alaska Experiment. So here's how this show works. They take 9 people and they drop them off in the middle of Alaska in this case. And those people have just very few supplies to go off of, and they travel as a group from shelter to shelter. Now, understand, I'll put quotes around shelter. Sometimes it's literally a tree branch they lean against a pile of rocks to make a place where they can sleep. But they have to travel these distances, find their own food, and do all this stuff. It's very physically exhausting, but more importantly, it's very emotionally exhausting. But they're out of their element, and they're searching somewhere that they've never been. Well, this is like John. John is at a place where he's never been. Because the reason John is there is the fact that there had been many attempts to kill him, but he wouldn't die. So the people that were attempting to kill him decided, you know what, if we can't kill this joker, we're going to get him out of our place. So they exiled him to the island of Patmos. And so John is in this place that he's never been by himself, and he hears a voice. And so I want to read Revelation chapter 1, verses 10 through 11. This was the first thing, one of the first things that John hears when he's on this island. In verse 10, it says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice as of a trumpet, saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. And what you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the next couple of chapters where John hears from Jesus and writes one letter to each of these 7 churches. It wasn't the only churches that existed at the time, but these were the 7 letters. And they're very important because of the number 7. You know, the number 7 in the Bible means maturity, perfection, or completion. And so here's what I believe for us today. I believe that when Jesus wanted John to write these letters, the reason why it was 7 churches and 7 letters was because Jesus' intent was to see his church, the local church and the body of Christ, people that have relationship with him, to come together and to be able to experience completion and maturity. Here's what I believe about each one of you today and myself. That when we read these letters, it's going to be an opportunity for us to invite God into our situation so that what feels incomplete, what feels broken, that he will begin to complete it. Now, before we get into these letters, I want to sort of set up how these letters are structured and what they're about. So there are 3 functions in each one of these 7 letters. The first function, and the reason it's there, is it is written for the local church, not just the past local church, but also the present local church. The second function of the letter is that it has a prophetic purpose. The intent of the letter is to speak to the future of things. That's what Revelation is really all about. It's talking about when Jesus returns, it reveals there is a heaven and there is a hell, and it talks about this prophetic nature. That's one of the reasons and functions of these letters. The third one is that it was written for us personally. And this is where I want us to sort of sit today, is in the personal aspect of why this letter was written. And the reason why I know they were written personally is because at the end of each letter, Jesus says, "And to him who has an ear to hear, let them hear." Today, we have ears to hear, so let's hear what God is saying to us personally. Now, you know when you were in school and you had to write papers and you had to have a hypothesis and you had to have certain structure. If you had to write a haiku poem, there was a certain structure to that. Well, with these letters, they are composed a certain way, and every letter is exactly the same. The composition of these letters and the way they're made up and the way that each one of them is written is that first, Jesus is introduced. So there's an introduction to who Jesus is, and in every letter he does it a different way by talking about who he is. Then there's an affirmation. So he talks to the church and says, "Attaboy, you're doing great. You're doing great in this area." But then there's a correction. And there's only one church he doesn't correct, and it's the church of Philadelphia that we'll get to later. So there's this correction, but then after that correction, there is an eternal motivation. There is if you choose to follow me, then this is what I will give you. So here's what I want us to get in our head today. The purpose of the letter is to make me better. The purpose of the letter is to make me better. On the count of 3, I want you to shout that out real loud. Football season is almost back, so act like you're yelling for your favorite team or something you like. So say that. I'm going to say it again before you say it. The purpose of the letter is to make me better. 1, 2, 3. Holler. All right, so I talked about this is going to be a personal thing because it's making us better. So let's look at 7 lessons we can learn from these 7 letters. So the first lesson we're going to learn comes from the church of Ephesus, and I'm going to read in Revelation chapter 2. So this is a letter to the church at Ephesus, and this is where we're going to learn our first lesson. So chapter 2 in Revelation, verse 2 through 4, it says, if I can see this fine print, "I know your works, your labor, your patience, and that you cannot bear those who are evil. And you have tested those who say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. And you have persevered and have patience and have labored for my name's sake and have not become weary." So there's the affirmation. "Nevertheless," so here comes the correction. "Nevertheless, I have this against you, that you have left your first love." So the first lesson we're going to learn today from Ephesus is don't leave your first love. Don't leave your first love. I love running into people who have been friends since they were kids. They've been friends like 20, 30 years, just best friends. Well, leaving our first love would be like having that best friend, and you still hang out with the best friend, and you're still around them, but you don't talk to each other. Neither one of you are smiling when you're around each other. If I was on the outside watching you and your friend, it doesn't look like there's any fun. You've lost that first love, but you're still hanging out, but the relationship is gone. You see, when it says that we need not to lose our first love, what I believe that's a relationally driven statement, meaning that our relationship with God needs to remain and be the core along with our actions, but the heart of the matter is the most important thing. Don't lose your first love. You know, I feel like one of the big reasons we lose our first love is because our circumstances in life change such that they don't look like the circumstances when we first fell in love the first time. Or the emotion of that first moment is not like the emotion that we feel now. And we feel like, I just fall out of love with this. You know, there's this smoking hot lady on the front row, my wife, Jalea. Now, dating back in college at NC State, there was a snow one year. I lived off campus in my apartment, and she lived on campus. I walked through the snow to see my lady. We're now married. When it snows, the best I can get walking through the snow to see my lady is out to the mailbox and back. Now, if I walked up to you and I said, you know what, I've just fallen out of love with Jalea, just fallen out of love with her. And you said, Michael, why have you fallen out of love with Jalea? The romance is gone. It's just gone. Well, what do you mean? I can't walk through the snow to see her anymore, so just the romance is gone. I've lost my first love for that. Or I tell you that, you know what? I love talking on the phone. And my love for talking on the phone started back when there were pay phones. If you don't know what a pay phone is, because you have to look on Antique Roadshow to know what one is now, you place a quarter or some amount of money in there to actually talk on the phone. They were everywhere. They were almost every gas station. You can't find one now. But if I said I love talking on the phone because it was a pay phone, and then now fast forward to today, and I said, you know, I just lost my love for talking on the phone. Why, Michael? It's just no pay phones. I missed out on the fact that I got a stinking smartphone that I could talk on and still experience that love because the circumstance or the emotion of it is very different. You see, the things that God taught me and grew me in my relationship with Him when I was in college are very different from the experience of what I've learned from Him in the last 7 years. Had I wanted to learn from Him the exact same way I did in college, then I would not have experienced and learned from Him what has been going on and what is different about the circumstances of my life over the last 7 years. We can't lose our first love. And our first love involves two things. It involves a passion for Jesus and what He's passionate about. It involves a passion for Jesus, so we have to know what He's passionate about. You know, when John heard this voice like a trumpet, he turned around and he saw what looked like to be the Son of Man. So that was Jesus talking to him. And he said that Jesus stood amongst 7 lampstands. Well, when Jesus began to talk to him, He revealed what those 7 lampstands were. He said the 7 lampstands represent each one of the 7 churches. So part of God's heart and where He wants to be present and where He wants to be active and where Jesus is in the local church. So if we want to know and operate and live in Jesus' passion, then we need to be connected to church. I don't care if you're broken, if you slipped up, messed up, if you feel ashamed to walk through the doors of a church, go to a church because that's where Jesus is and that's where we can experience His healing. The second thing where we find our first love and what it involves is our compassion for other people. And we see this when Jesus was actually alive in Matthew chapter 9, verses 36 through 38. He said, but when Jesus saw the multitudes, He was moved with compassion for them because they were weary and scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Then He said to His disciples, the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into His harvest. The prayer is not for the harvest, the prayer is for the laborers. And the reason why the prayer is for the laborers is because Jesus understands that it requires us to stay in contact with our first love so that we'll be willing to go out and tell other people. I love talking about my wife to people because I love her. And the first love that we had 15 years ago is the same that it is today. But we've worked at it to keep it stirred up. That's why He said, I pray for the laborers, because we need not lose our first love. Now, sometimes our compassion can be killed. That it can become challenging with certain people to be compassionate because something has been done to us. Or you see somebody that didn't act or do what they said they would do, and so you find it hard to be compassionate towards them. My brother-in-law likes to look around the internet and Craigslist and all this stuff, and my sister was telling me that they passed this guy on the road who holds up a sign that says, I need money for food, and he's homeless. And my brother-in-law was always a little skeptical. And so my brother-in-law began to look on the internet and stuff. And he found this story that a news crew did. And it was about this homeless guy. When they found the homeless guy was driving a Range Rover. Now, when you hear something about that, it can rob the compassion that God wants you to have for people that are in need because you think they're just taking advantage of you. We cannot allow our compassion to leave because if we do, then we will veer away from our first love. The purpose of the letter is to make us better. So let's look at lesson number 2. Lesson number 2 comes from the church at Smyrna. The church at Smyrna. This is chapter 2, verse 10, and it says this. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Everybody shout 10. 10. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. The second lesson is to be ready for intimidation. To be ready for intimidation. Now, the scripture here talks about be ready to be persecuted. I didn't use that word because sometimes in our American culture, it's hard for us to connect with persecution. Because when we think of persecution, we think, I've been locked up, I've been killed, I've been beat, I've been hurt. But what happens to us in our American culture is not typically that, but what does happen is we get intimidated by rules and regulations that are made. Intimidated by the culture that is around us, telling us we need to do this or we need to do that. The question is, are we gonna fall under the intimidation that the enemy is throwing at us through our culture, or are we gonna rise up and be faithful? Now, it says in there, you will have tribulation for 10 days. 10 is an important number, just like 7 is, because 10 is the number of testing. So the question is are we gonna stand up when our faith is tested? When our tenacity and that love and that push for God in our lives, are we going to stand up when that seems like it's being pressured or persecuted or intimidated? What about our giving? Are we going to continue to walk forward whenever there's intimidation towards our giving, saying, don't give to that church because they're just using the money any old kind of way they want to? But the reality is that we're not held responsible for what the church does with the money. We're held responsible for what we as individuals do with that money. Here's a cool story about the pastor, bishop at the church of Smyrna, and it's this, and I want to read it to you. It says, the pastor of the church at Smyrna was a man named Polycarp, the last man that was a personal disciple of John. At 86 years of age, amidst one of the numerous waves of persecution, Polycarp was ordered to burn incense at the altar of Caesar. So he was ordered to worship and to give homage and to give his loyalty to Caesar. And then Polycarp says this, how can I deny him, talking about God, who has been faithful to me these 680 years? Consequently, he was sentenced to burn at the stake. But when the fire failed to come near him, the fire wouldn't even come to burn him up. When it failed to come near him, a frustrated guard pierced his shoulder with a sword, inadvertently drawing blood, which put out the flame. You know, there's a scripture later on in Revelation in chapter 12. It says, we overcome the scheme of the enemy through the power of the blood and the power and the word of our testimony. You see, we have to remember that it's Jesus' power through his blood that allows us to stand up when intimidation comes against us or persecution comes against us. The purpose of the letter is to make us better. So let's look at number 3. Lesson number 3 comes from a church in Pergamos, and it's Revelation chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. It says this, I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days of which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. Now, so the lesson we need to learn here is don't get in bed with the world. Don't get in bed with the world. Now, it references this story of Balaam and Balak. And this story comes from Numbers chapters 22 through 24. And let me sort of sum up what this story is about so we can get the understanding that we don't need to go to bed with the world as a lesson. So Balak is the king of the Moabites. And Balak looks out one day and he sees the Israelite people setting up camp close to where he has authority and close to his land. And he gets scared. And the reason he gets scared is because he knows that the Israelites are capable of big things. They had already got wiped out one group of people. And so he is fearful, and every Moabite person is scared to death because they've heard. So what Balak does is he goes to get some spiritual advice and assistance. And he sends for Balaam. And he says, Balaam, here's what I want you to do. I need you to see these Israelite people and how big they're growing in number, and I need you to speak a curse over them, because if you speak a curse, they'll be cursed. Any man that's blessed will be blessed. Any man that's cursed will be cursed. So through a series of events and multiple times, Balaam decides not to do it, because Balaam tells Balak, he says, look, I will go and seek, but whatever God tells me to do, that's what I'm going to stand firm and do. God told him not to harm the Israelites and not to curse them. Instead, he told them to be blessed. And so Balak just gets mad at Balaam, and for a moment, they part ways. Well, when you get into chapter 25 of Numbers, it says that the Israelite men begin to commit sexual immorality and sleep with the Moabite women. You see, what the men of Moab couldn't do, the women of Moab had the ability to do. You women are strong now, strong. So they're sleeping with these Moabite women. A curse falls on them, and they have to do certain things to remove that curse and allow God's blessing. We find out later in Numbers chapter 31 that one of the key people involved in getting the Moabite women to go down and begin to sleep with the men and introduce idols is Balaam. So the question for us is are we going to continue to stand firm, or are we going to allow ourselves to gradually sleep and fall asleep in the bed of what the world offers us? We have to be careful and learn the lesson that we cannot get into bed with the world. The purpose of the letter is to make me better. So let's look at lesson number 4. Lesson number 4 comes from the church at Thyatira. The church at Thyatira. I had to listen to somebody else pronounce this so I would even know how to say it. So Revelation chapter 2, verse 20. Revelations 2:20 says this. It says, nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman, Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. The lesson we learn here is we have to guard against a Jezebel spirit. Guard against a Jezebel spirit. Now, hopefully the question that just popped in your mind is, who is Jezebel and what does that mean to guard against a Jezebel spirit? Jezebel, if you look back in the Old Testament, she's the wife of King Ahab. King Ahab is known as one of the most evil and ruthless and wicked kings of all the time. Now, the reason he was like that was not on his own. It was because Jezebel had great influence. Just like, remember I told you women, just like the Moabite women went down there and had influence and did things the men couldn't do, Jezebel influenced Ahab, and he followed and did everything that she said. And he became the most evil one, the most evil king that ever existed. Now, the thing about a Jezebel spirit is take your mind off the fact that she's female, because it doesn't have to do with gender. A Jezebel spirit is when we are controlling, when we are manipulative, when we are overbearing, or when we try to be divisive. Guard ourselves against a Jezebel spirit. I love this phrase, guard ourselves, because when I think about guarding, I think about boxing. And you know, when you see somebody fight or box, they're supposed to have their hands up. The reason why is because when we guard ourselves, it's a proactive position and we're ready to act, and we don't waste time and we don't lose time. Could you imagine seeing two boxers, or at least one of the two boxers, walking around with his arms down, just dying? You know, it doesn't seem like it takes long to go from here, but when you're boxing, this length of time will get you knocked out. We have to guard, dukes up, against a Jezebel spirit. We can't manipulate. We can't try to be overbearing. We have to guard against it. The purpose of the letter is to make me better. Lesson number 5. let's look at the church of Sardis. The church of Sardis. And we're going to look at Revelation chapter 3, verses 1 through 2. Revelation 3, 1 and 2, it says, and to the angel of the church of Sardis, write these things. Say, he who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars, I know your works, that you have a name, that you are alive, but you are dead. Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die, for I have not found your works perfect before God. Now that word perfect doesn't mean perfection. It means maturing. It means fully rounded. It means whole. So he said, be careful and remember to strengthen those things. So here is the lesson for Sardis. Don't give up. Don't give up is lesson number 5. You see, one way we don't give up is that we keep our faith alive. I was talking to this guy who trains people working out, and he said he trains this guy who's like 61 years old, and he said the guy is able to do things physically that you just wouldn't think someone at 61 would be able to do. And he made this statement to us. He said the reason why this man is able to do what he's able to do at the age of 61 is because he has the highest mental strength and capacity and fight out of anyone that I've ever trained. You know, our faith is meant to be like that. That when we want to give up and we don't want to do anymore, we have to let our faith strengthen up so that we'll continue to perfection, maturing, and completion. Now, the way that we get our faith strengthened is through our works. Here's what James said, so you don't take my word for it. James chapter 2, verses 14 through 17 says, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warm and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Do you know that faith, when I read James, faith is intended to be an action word? Just like we did the whole Serve Charlotte, that was people going out and exercising their faith. Because the reality is, especially in our day and age, people are going to come to know God and His power and know that He is different from the life they're living when they see someone else living a life that is different from what they're living and experiencing a peace that they don't know anything about. The greatest way that we can tell people about God is through the way that we choose to live our lives and align ourselves with what God is doing. The purpose of the letter is to make me better. All right, lesson 6. Everybody say 6. Lesson 6 comes from the Church of Philadelphia, not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it's in Revelation chapter 3, verse 10. And it says this in verse 10. It says, because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial, which shall come upon you, the whole world, to test those who dwell on the earth. So the lesson we learn from Philadelphia is to remain faithful no matter what. Faithful no matter what. There's a movie that I saw. It came out around late 90s, early 2000s. It's called Men of Honor. The two main characters in it are Robert De Niro and Cuba Gooding Jr. It's based on a true story. And the premise of the movie is that you have Cuba Gooding Jr., who wants to become a master chief diver and salvage expert and going and doing reconnaissance on the bottom of these oceans and finding things. He wants to become that in the Navy. There's a few problems in his way. Not only is it very difficult to become that, but it's at a time where he would be the first black man to ever achieve such a thing. So there's a lot of racial intensity. There's a lot of things that he encounters in the movie that are unjust simply because of his ethnicity. Now, we come to this one scene. He's gone and made it in the class and has been going through this training for 6 months. And they've gradually weaned out a lot of the people in the group, and they're down to about 7 or 8 guys. Just before they have to complete this last task, Robert De Niro comes in. He's the master chief. He's the one that's training them. He comes up to Cuba Gooding Jr. and he says this. He says, don't even waste your time coming out for this last test you have. because the head guy who runs this, they call him Pappy, he's not going to allow you to pass no matter how well you do. And Cuba says to him, but I'm the best. And he says, you are the best, but you're not going to pass. So the scene shifts to all these other guys except Cuba Gooding Jr. putting on this heavy diver suit where they lock a helmet on. You have shoes that are made of just weighted down so you sink to the bottom. You have an air hose connected. All of a sudden, Cuba Gooding Jr. shows up and sits down. And he looks at Robert De Niro and doesn't say a thing, but he's there to take the test. Now, the test is this. Down on the bottom of the ocean floor, there's a flange. It's just big pieces like a big pipe system with a valve and all stuff. It's down there. They have to go down, get that, and once they get it, they say, I've located my flange. Once they do that, then the people up on the dock toss down a bag that has all their tools, that has all the nuts, the bolts, the washers, all the pieces to put this flange together. What happens is Cuba goes down and he says, I found my flange, send me my bag. They don't. Finally, when they do, the guy on the deck takes the bag, takes his knife and cuts it, throws it out. He says, your tools are on the ocean floor bottom. They are scattered everywhere. Cuba Gooding Jr. is down in the bottom of the water, hard to see with a big flashlight. The water is freezing cold, mind you. About 6 to 7 hours later, it is dark. He's the only one in the water. Finally, there's a tug on his rope. They pull up a fully complete flange. He passed. He became, later on, a master chief diver. The reason was because of his faithfulness. In life, people are going to do things to us, and it's going to feel like they've cut the bag of our life and thrown it on the ground. And we have the right to stand up and go, you know what, I'm coming out of this water and I'm not going to do it anymore because of what they did to me. Or we can learn a lesson from the Church of Philadelphia and remain faithful. And let our faithfulness speak a lot louder than our defense verbally. Are we willing to be faithful? Because the purpose of the letter is to make me better. The last one that we see, lesson 7, is from Laodicea. And it's in Revelation chapter 3, verses 15 through 17. I'm going to read this. It says, I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I could wish you were cold or hot. So then, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out my mouth. Because you say, I am rich, have become wealthy, and have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. The last lesson is to stay hungry. The last lesson that we learn is to stay hungry. Laodicea was on the side of a mountain. Down it came 2 streams, one that was hot, one that was cold. The people used and utilized these streams, the hot for certain things in their livelihood, the cold for other things. But one day they decided to combine the 2 streams and make it lukewarm. You see, when Jesus was saying this, he wasn't saying that hot is good and cold is bad. What he's saying is that hot served a purpose that was beneficial. Cold serves a purpose that's beneficial. Lukewarm does not serve the purpose. It robs from those purposes. And if you're lukewarm, I would rather spit you out of my mouth because you're not having any good fruit anywhere. We have to stay hungry. If you will, stand to your feet with me. You know, when I look out here to this room, I see people that are ready to stay hungry. That God is doing something inside your heart, and he's asking you, will you stay hungry for me? You know, the Bible says, in Mark, it says, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they will be filled. My question I ask you today is, do you want to be filled? Will you stay hungry? Will you and I learn these lessons? You see, hopefully there was one of these lessons today that you just really got stuck on and that resonated with you. I believe that at least one of these lessons, God was speaking to you directly. and was encouraging you that I have an eternal hope, and I want you to be a part of that.